and the need for this is this idea of, we've heard this term for over a decade now, the ongoing data deluge, but I always like to sort of put this in perspective. You know, in May of 2019, YouTube users uploaded more than 500 hours of new video footage. Walmart processes $36 million of sales transactions an hour. You can go to the Library of Congress today and download 74 terabytes of freely available data. And IBM is estimating hundreds of thousands of job openings in data professionals. And I think that's really exciting. And for a long time, we had this vision of information is gushing towards your brain like a fire hose aimed at a teacup. But I like to think about, how can we have fun in the data deluge? What are interesting, fun ways we can think about using big data? What are fun problems to tackle in this sense? And then what are real world applied problems for more serious sorts of data analyses? And one fun thing we've been doing lately is what we coined as urban climate informatics. So here we're looking at urban form, composition, design, and green infrastructure impacts on urban climate, trying to think about the formation of urban heat islands, local microclimates, introduce of buildings, pedestrian heat stress. And you may get the sense that in Phoenix, we're worried about heat. Rightly so, it's very hot here. But what's interesting is there's sort of this lack of fine-skilled data to describe the form and function of cities. For a long time, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency sort of thought about things as you have one satellite that costs $1 billion, you take images. Now we have billions of sensors that cost $1 each. And how can we sort of think about, well, what data is available that might let us get to this local fine-scaled microclimate? How can urban form and function be described? And one thought we had was scaling up using data from Google Street View and Google Earth. If you take Google Earth virtual camera tours along a predefined path, you can get images of regions at a 5-meter spatial resolution. You know, the camera height, the view angle, you can get screenshots in every cardinal direction. And we can take these and we can turn them into synthetic fisheye photos that show us the region around a particular location in the cityscape. And then we can start applying deep learning techniques to get information about these different features. Primarily, we started with what was called trying to extract the sky view factor, looking at sky view footprints for urban climate modeling. So here we were just taking our images and trying to train them to detect sky or not sky. And what we can do with that is find the fraction of visible sky viewed from the ground up. And this is really commonly used by urban climatologists to quantify the openness of a site. And this influences the amount of incoming and outgoing solar terrestrial radiation. And I work with Dr. Ariana Middle, who has this really interesting sensor device called MARTI that she drives around the different cities and collects these different local climate readings. And then we can see if we can take the big data, model it, and does that correlate to the measurements that MARTI is getting for these local microclimates. And here at the bottom, you see a bunch of different street view images that we've turned into these fisheye photos to look at sort of different sky view factors for a particular urban landscape. And we can plot these for different cities around the country. Here's a picture of sort of the urban sprawl of Phoenix and its downtown areas. So the brighter the red, the less sky is visible. So you can sort of see the downtown Phoenix corridor with the high rises, and then the sprawling out from the suburbs with light blue, where there's not really much blockage in terms of how much sky is visible. And what we did is we're taking this and trying to then determine measures of thermal comfort. So there's lots of research on how hot does a person feel that it is. So if it's 110 degrees outside in Phoenix, how hot does the person feel it is? And that depends actually quite a lot on some of the ambient properties of the urban form. In Phoenix, it's quite dry. If you stand in the shade, you may feel that temperature is a lot different than in the direct sunlight. And so we take our measurements of sky view factor, calculate the mean radiant temperature, which is the measure of the average temperature of the surfaces that surround a person, sum these long and shortwave radiations up, and we can calculate all of this from just using those fisheye photos. And what's fun then is we know the position of the sun at a given time of day. We know the sky view factor. So at a given time of day, we can calculate the ambient local temperature. And you can start thinking about, well, can we use this to actually plot better walking routes across campus, let's say, or can we use this to determine how we should develop shade structures and what orientation we should put this shade structure. So here we were thinking about how would you walk from my office, the Brickyard Engineering Building, to this yellow dot that I've labeled as the Memorial Union. And you might say, well, I only am willing to spend an extra 5 or 10 seconds on my walk. So you give some sort of parameter on how much longer you're willing to take. And we try to route you through the shadiest path on a given time of day. And you can see there's 2 different paths you might take depending on the time of day. Of course, the feedback was interesting. This wound up being a Popular Press News article that was posted. And I think the first comment on the Popular Press article from someone was, even my dog is smart enough to walk in the shade. Why are we spending money on this? But what's interesting about all of this is you can use this for urban planning features and ideas, starting to think about where should we put shade trees. If I know the class schedule for all the students in campus, what are the most likely paths they're going to walk? At what time of day are they going to walk that? How can I orient my shade structures to try to minimize their or maximize their thermal comfort? How can I make the walk most comfortable for them? And I thought this was a really fun project. And like I said, this is using this idea of big data, urban landscapes, and how can we find proxy data sets to ask interesting questions and be able to support things like urban climate informatics. And all of this is led with my colleague, Dr. Ariana Middle. A lot of this work is coming from her NSF Career Award as well. So I'd be remiss not to give her all the credit for really doing this. But along with having fun in the data deluge with urban climate and Google Street View, and we use that for things like walkability scores for neighborhoods, connecting that to health impacts and all sorts of other extensions. We can also think of fun things like names. What does a name have to do with a particular location? And I can actually mine the white pages, taking all 78 million phone name address pairs in the white pages. I now have your name, I have your home address. With your home address, I can link this to places like Zillow or the census to estimate your net worth. I can link this to the census name distribution to estimate how old you are. If I have all of this linked in a website where people can visualize this, I can also start thinking about, well, okay, if a person at this IP address searched for Ross Maciejewski, likely they're probably more related to Ross Maciejewski than somebody who didn't search for Ross Maciejewski. You're not going to search for a random person's name, perhaps. And so we can start creating visualizations and trying to explore this sort of data and thinking about how do names relate to a particular region in the country. So here we think about, what's in a name. And here we're looking at the name Montague across the US. And we see Montague, so we had Romeo Montague. We see if you're a Montague, you're probably located in the Eastern United States, in Virginia, North Carolina. You probably grew up next to people named Wilson, Pettit. So we create a word map where the size of the wordle and the color of the wordle is related to how much does the map of that name correlate to the map of the Montague name, for example. And we can look at this for last names like Maciejewski land. Maciejewski is a very Polish name. And if you know anything about Polish immigration to the United States, you wouldn't be surprised by this map. You can see Chicago and the Polish belt going to New York City. Chicago is the largest Polish city in the world, actually. More Polish people live there than in Warsaw. And then knowing the name address pair, I can start connecting this to census data. I can guess that on average, Maciejewski has a median income of $57,000 from the census data. I could do the same, trying to do a proxy based on net worth from their house from Zillow, for example. We don't have to just stick with last names. We can stick with first names. So we can see where people named Ross might live around the country and see distributions of Rosses. We see Ross is actually a somewhat common name in Utah. And we can again look at the average median income for Rosses. We can start guessing when a Ross might have been born. So we can look at the age distribution of Ross across the years. We can see Ross sort of peaked in maybe 1985. So my mom was a little bit ahead of the curve. I was born in 1979. But it's really exciting when I show this demo to people. We can try other names. So here's the map of the Johnsons across the United States. And Chris was telling me his origins were German and Scandinavian. And if you pick a purely Scandinavian sort of name, you'll see definitely hotspots in Minnesota. And so we can see sort of the distributions of Johnsons across the United States. We can try this for Hansons as well. So I get the impression that Hansons typically come from, immigrated to Minnesota, Chicago. You can see the hotspot in Utah as well. We can see they grew up next to Christiansens and Olesons and Jorgesons, for example. We can do this for other names as well. So Pascucci, for example, we see the main immigration hotspot of Italian immigrants to the US from the port of New York there. And all of these are really interesting things to play with. We've created different sorts of flow maps for trying to look at migration patterns, because the real bottom line for things is people don't move that much. So names tend to associate with a particular place and have a lot of interesting history. And part of what I wanted to get to later in the talk today is thinking about, well, now how can I move further towards explaining some of the patterns that we're seeing in these maps? And how can I help people bring in secondary information to think about explaining these geographical patterns that we're seeing? But since we're at the, since I'm talking to the Ski Institute today, I also wanted to talk about how I can connect this to some more traditional scientific visualization sorts of ideas. And to create these maps, basically I have a whole bunch of points across the US, and I create a scalar field using kernel density estimation. So I take all the points, I aggregate them into the scalar field. And if I have a scalar field, I can start trying to apply some different scientific visualization techniques. And for a long time, I was always interested in thinking about, can we apply some of these topological constructs for geographic visualization? So if we use things, take our scalar field and apply things like the merge tree or read graph or persistence diagram, persistence curves, what does that get us? And in this next example, what I want to talk about is policing. So policing works kind of the same as the example I showed with the names. We have a whole bunch of points where crimes took place. In my map here on the right, I'm showing a picture of Chicago. And all of the points I have there are different gangs that have had a criminal incident report in Chicago. So I have a point distribution for the year of 2017 of all the gang activity in Chicago. And typically what police will do is they look at hotspot policing, where they set some threshold level and look at where the places where the majority of crime is taking place. And we can, of course, do that with super level set segmentation in topology. So we can set some sort of current threshold. So here I can set my threshold at 0.7. All the hotspots with the density value above that 0.7 are illustrated, highlighted in the map. We can allow people to interactively change this threshold and see how different hotspots emerge. So local hotspots at a much lower level, but now you see this general hotspot is sort of combined. And we see how this changes depending on how we pick that particular threshold. So, but if I'm thinking about gangs and gang activity, it may be interesting to think about, well, do any of these particular hotspots directly relate to a particular gang type? It's not that I couldn't, of course, do a scalar field for each gang individually, but that's not necessarily how police want to look at their data. They often want to look at crime as an aggregate function, to look at the overall sort of hotspot landscape, to think about how they can distribute resources to best tackle problems at the aggregate level. So that's why we're looking at sort of the aggregate level and thinking about how we might break apart different hotspots and what is the underlying mechanisms from the multivariate aspects of these hotspots that might be driving crime in a location. So we started thinking about, well, what if we try things like merge tree leaf segmentation, where we're highlighting the parts of the domain that are uniquely associated with a given maximum in the data set. And so here we can hover over a particular leaf branch and we can see which hotspot is associated with this. And the colors on the map right now are just simply the branch ID. So each branch is given a unique ID, and I color each hotspot by its particular underlying branch. And this was interesting because I can sort of pick out some of these local hotspots and segment this. But we wanted to see if we could go a little bit further, and started then playing with merge tree crown segmentation, where we provide a region whose points have at most a certain density difference relative to their associated maximum subtree. And again, all of these are just colored by the branch ID right now. We're going to get into some more extensions to this in a second. And we can see how this merge tree crown segmentation allows us to now maybe get a different set of local hotspots that are starting to make more sense geographically to the police. And as we decrease the crown height to detect hotspots with smaller boundaries, we can see the differences as things begin to emerge on the map. And finally, if we combine this idea of merge tree crown segmentation and MCS together, we can differentiate between individual hotspots. And so here, the combination can extract these various components, and we can get these interesting local regional hotspot splits. And you can see where on the left there, we have that red and light blue hotspot, and we can see that local segmentation in a particular area, depending on how we select the crown height. We can incorporate things like the Morse complex, Morse smell complex. We can detect hotspots based on local activities, and we can even find that particular regions are associated with particular gangs. So for example, here, what I've done in this picture is I have colored now the hotspot based on the majority gang within a particular region. So you can imagine within that topology, I have a whole bunch of points. Let's say we have 5 points that are from gang A and 1 point from gang B. So we color that based on the underlying majority. And this gives us an idea of where different gang territories might be and how these different hotspots might be dominated by a particular underlying category or type of crime. And this wound up being a pretty effective way to show some of these maps to the police. And so we built out this system for doing scalar field topology for hotspot analysis for crimes. And here I wanted to show a nice example of how we did this for just data in Tippecanoe County. So I did my PhD at Purdue. We've worked with the police there for well over a decade now, building out these different tools. And here, of course, we can do our super level set segmentation. We can see where the sort of peaks of crime are within Purdue University and West Lafayette. And to talk a little bit about the geography in this picture here, you'll see these three major hotspots. The blue hotspot to the left, that is downtown campus. The hotspot on the right is downtown Lafayette, Indiana. And the hotspot here out in the periphery is the local mall. There's only one mall in this small town. And these hotspots are well known to police. But what's really nice is that doing this topological abstraction maps directly to their mental model of what's going on in the town. And this has been the case with all of the different crime data sets that we've worked with. So it seems to indicate that this topological extraction method is working really well with mapping to what's expected in the underlying data. And what's fun about this is now we can look at global and local hotspots. We can do our leaf component segmentation. And what happens here is there's noise outlined in the periphery of the data set. So we can combine this with things like using the persistence diagram and persistence curve to get rid of some of this noise. This happens because you may have one or two crimes that have occurred in sort of subdivisions out in town, but these aren't really important, but they wind up creating sort of local hotspots within the underlying scalar field. And now we can color our hotspots based on the majority crime type within a region. So you saw here in the, whoops, let me go back a second. Here in the video, we see the river here is this gray line separating the blue and green hotspot. To the left is the university downtown, to the right is the city downtown. And I've colored the hotspots now by their majority crime that's occurring within that region. And what I thought was really exciting about this is you see that geographic separation by the river feature. So yes, these are both crime hotspots, and they're very close neighbors, but they have different crime profiles. And this is also well known, but it's really exciting that we can extract this out. And we can do things like overlay pie charts here, and you can see green is related to theft. So in downtown downtown Lafayette, you have more theft. In campus area, you have more drunkenness and public intoxication. And you can see the red crime, which is noise, occurs more noise complaints in the college area, whereas in downtown, you get more theft and burglary sorts of complaints. So really exciting to see how this topological structure actually was able to break apart and separate these two hotspots. And then when we map those two underlying components of the data, we can really see different features about what might be driving crime in a particular location. And of course, as we change our crown components and our level sets, we can adjust these and get different separations and show different hotspots and zoom in, look at different distributions. And so this wound up being a really interesting mechanism for applying some of these topological aspects that people in SciViz are very familiar with to a different sort of problem set. I'm not saying we invented any new mathematical concepts here, but I really enjoyed being able to apply these concepts to this problem in geography and policing to see how this might break apart different data sets. And a lot of this came about from previous work, working with the group at Kaiserslautern with Jonas Lukacek, where we were trying to think about how can we visualize spatiotemporal flows. And we can extend our typical spatial kernel density estimate to handle temporal flows as well. So creating a space-time cube and then extracting the flow topology from there. And what we were trying to think about is there a way to sort of show how geographic events might have some sort of spread, specifically thinking about disease vectors now. So we did a lot of work during my PhD thesis and onwards on how do we map disease for a map. And obviously these disease hotspots can change over time as disease vectors spread. We even had tools on pandemic influenza. And so we started thinking about, well, you know, Charles Menard proposed his very famous flow map where you see Napoleon's army march towards Moscow, and by the time it's decimated, you see it move back. Can we use this sort of idea to be able to map these sorts of topological structures to a single map image and try to get a nice representation? And so we took a data set on foot and mouth disease. Foot and mouth disease is highly infectious, severe viral disease of farm livestock. They had an outbreak in 2001 in the United Kingdom. We know the incubation period, so we can get the bandwidth for the temporal lag for setting up our kernel density estimate. We know the suggested quarantine radius, so we can get the spatial bandwidth. And then we can use this to calculate the scalar field over space and time for how these incidents of foot and mouth disease spread. And what we did is we created a read graph of the foot and mouth disease data set for different level sets, different thresholds, to see how the different hotspots might have emerged over space and time. And so each line in my A, B, and C graphs here are particular dates in the data set. You can see those corresponding to the map images at the top. And we can see we have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease on the first day. We see a couple days later, we have another on the orange branch of the topology. Those two sort of merge over time. As time goes on, you have the hotspots sort of break off and decreasing in magnitude over time. We can try different levels of thresholds and different sorts of read graphs. And what we did is we attempted to project this read graph onto the map with different temporal labels to try to show how these hotspots moved. Overall, I'm not too satisfied with the results. I think this was an interesting visualization to try. You'll see these dashed lines and things jumping around. Primarily, it was hard to think about where should we be placing the centroid of the hotspot, and because the centroid can move so quickly between days, how do we sort of capture this in an intelligent way? I don't think this visualization wound up working as well as I'd hoped. This sort of method worked really well in sort of showing the temporal evolution of hotspots, but it's really hard to connect these read graphs directly to their spatial locations. And so I was hoping by projecting this on the map, we could do a little better. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement and new ideas for things we might be able to do to capture some of this spatial temporal visualization in a single image where we don't necessarily have to rely on animation, where we know there's sometimes quite a lot of problems in visualizing space and time using animation. I'm not saying animation is bad, it was just, I wanted to see if there were ways where we might be able to get around this. And so in our research group, we've been trying lots of different creative ways to visualize spatial temporal data, and not always successfully. This wound up being a very nice paper overall in trying this out. We've had other things where we've tried multivariate mapping to data sets. So here was what we call bristle maps, where we would take the different kernel density estimation values and map these to underlying components of the geography, in this case, the street. And so we could orient the direction of the lines, could map to a particular component of the data set, the length of the lines, the color of the lines. And this allowed us to try to create maps that had more than one or two sorts of variables. And here I'm looking at vandalism and theft, and again, downtown West Lafayette. And you can find areas with high vandalism and low theft, low vandalism and high theft, and then low or high areas. We did some user studies and we found that these sorts of maps were as effective as choropleth maps in general map tasks such as rate estimations and identifications. We tried things like creating typographic maps, so exploring cartographic representations where we'd seen in the early 2000s this beautiful micrography work coming from SIGGRAPH as well as hand-drawn typography images. And we thought, well, why can't we do that automatically? We talked to the artists that were creating these typographic maps, and they were taking days and days to create those. We created an algorithm to automatically create these typographic maps. We're now features such as roads, rivers, and parks can be mapped directly to text. And then we started thinking about, well, can these methods be used to help in underlying analyses? So we have a lot of Twitter data that's geographically referenced. We can find underlying clusters and subclusters of words and dialogue within those. So we can try things like taking a particular region and looking for subtweet clusters within those. So here I'm looking at a pumpkin fest that was occurring at a particular festival in Ohio this year. And you can see here, people are talking about the pumpkin festival. And we sort of map that to the outer ring. And you can see the general dialogue is people are talking about a riot that occurred and the SWAT team was brought in. But as we zoom down with the different dialogue, we can see here in this primarily green and red region, you're seeing helicopters and how things are crazy and insane. And over to the right within that same festival region, you're seeing people talking about how they're happy and carving some pumpkins. And so here we're trying to take this spatial localization, split out clusters, and trying to show different context preserving text data exploration across different scales of geography as well. And this worked out reasonably well and was an honorable mention in CHI 2018. And I had sort of hinted at this with the names data, but with all of these, a lot of the stories that I've been telling you require underlying contextual knowledge of the data. And I've been trying to think about, well, how can we move forward with this? How do we get to this idea of explaining what we're seeing with these different maps in a way that can help support the analysts tell their story to their bosses, or how can we help people use these complex geographic models for telling stories? And so we've been building out this tool that we call Geoexplainer, which is designed primarily for geographic analyses focused right now on geographic weighted regression. So you use geographic weighted regression to look for local spatial relationships with high dimensional data. So for example, I'm going to show you a geographic weighted regression model for the 2016 election, where we're trying to look at underlying demographic features and whether or not those predict that you'll have more registered Democrats in an area versus more registered Republicans. And what we can do is we can try to automatically generate text to explain different facets of the geographic distribution, the geographic weighted regression model. So we can have things like the model diagnostics. We can provide information about the AIC and the R squared and the adjusted R squared. So our model for this fit is quite nice. But if I were to try to explain what an R squared means to more general populace, that might be difficult. So trying to think about how we might be able to explain these. Here, the graph I'm showing is all the residuals and the distribution of the data variables that are used for this regression. And so again, in this regression, I'm trying to predict registered Democrats in a county and seeing if there is a relationship between gender, ethnic distribution, income, age, and all of these demographic factors that are available in the US Census. And so we can automatically generate text to try to help explain model performance. We can give them ideas about the expected value of Moran's I, which is a global indicator of spatial heterogeneity. We can talk about the p-value for the model. We can talk about how the residuals exhibit strong spatial dependency. And all of this text is automatically generated. And what we've set up here is that all of the features of this visualization that I'm showing can be dragged and dropped into this text report panel on the right to capture the things that the analyst thinks is important in telling their story. And we'll show how this works. Along with this, we also try to look at local patterns. So if the user were to select a particular residual from the model and want to know how the fit of the regression weights, whether those were statistically significant or not, this text gets automatically filled out. So for example, now we're looking at the percentage of people between 18 and 29 in a given spatial region. Areas on the map that are colored in now are statistically significant. And here we're trying to describe what's being seen on the map, and all of this text is generated automatically. So we see 20 noun counties in the east, 11 counties in the central part of the US have a positive relationship, meaning that people in those regions between 18 and 29 are more likely to be registered as Democrats. On the west, those regions, we're seeing people between 18 and 29 are more likely to be registered as a Republican. And we can drag and drop this into our text report panel, like I mentioned before, directly grabbing that set of text and pulling it into there. But of course, this goes back then to the question of, well, why are these regions in a particular part of the country more likely to have young people registered as Democrats? And you can zoom into the map. And for those of you that are familiar with US schools, you can obviously probably pick out in Indiana, here we have Bloomington, and this highly local region where young people are more likely to be Democrats is centered directly around Bloomington, Indiana, which is home to Indiana University, which is a quite famous sort of liberal stronghold in that state. The other hotspot that maybe was harder for me to, not hotspot, the other area that was tending more towards young people being registered as Democrats and had a statistically significant local neighborhood was this region in Ohio. And I wasn't familiar with this region. But what our system is set up to do is it's set up to pull in external information so you can learn more about what are features in that area. So specifically linking to places like Wikipedia, Twitter, Reddit. And so here we can click on a particular county. It directly pulls up the Wikipedia data. We find that this particular county is Athens County, is a Democratic stronghold. It's only one of only 2 counties in Ohio to vote for George McGovern. And you can also take this information and drag it into your sort of reporting function as well to sort of explain why this particular region might have underlying drivers where it's seeing young people turn out more to be registered Democrats. We can also take screenshots of the map. We can drag those directly into our text reporting toolkit. And we're able to sort of build out this idea of how can we help someone doing these geographic weighted regressions or data explorations in space and time, build out some sort of explanation, taking into account information about the model, automatic text generation, and visual authoring, and combining these all together for geospatial exploration. And with all of this, a lot of my work is primarily focused on creating geographic decision support systems. So thinking about how we can build tools to help people with crime analytics. So that's the iPad version I'm showing you on the right with some of our early crime work. I'm sorry, on the left. On the right is our spatial temporal search and rescue visualization that we've built out for the Coast Guard, trying to show where search and rescue cases take place and giving them, combining this operations research methodologies for thinking about how we can deploy resources. And that intersection has been really quite fruitful of thinking about how we could take high performance computation simulations with operations research and combine these together into decision support systems for really challenging real world problems. So there's a high performance computing simulation called Blossom, which takes into account bathymetry and ambient blowout patterns. So if you have an oil spill in a location, it knows the flow of current in the ocean, it knows the weather, and it does high performance simulations for where the oil would go to over time. And we also have information on where are vessels that have the capacity to help clean up oil spills. And we can create an operations research optimization module that would say, okay, taking this information in from the Blossom oil spill blowout model, where should I deploy my resources? And this becomes an interesting problem because you can say, well, I only have this much money for cleanup, and I want to protect these particular regions. I want to make sure that I want to stop the oil from beaching in these regions because maybe there's endangered species, or maybe these regions are economically very, very critical for recovery. And so we can create visualization sorts of tools to let people explore and compare different profiles of cleanup methods. So here we added some simple tools for comparing different costs. So if we say, okay, let's spend 100% of our budget in the first 3 days and send out the boats, what does this look like versus sending out only 80% of our budget? How much of the cleanup is impacted? What areas are impacted in the future? And allowing people to compare across these different sorts of profiles with these interactive visualization tools. And all of this sort of ties into the main thing I do in my job is now I run what's called the Center for Accelerating Operational Efficiency. This was awarded in 2017 as a $40 million grant from the US Department of Homeland Security, looking at this intersection of operations research, economic analysis, homeland security, risk sciences, and data analytics. And we have about 15 different funded research projects across our different consortium here of partners, working on all sorts of interesting problems, from how can we model arrival curves to the airport to improve staffing, to how can we use deep learning to predict migration patterns from the Northern Triangle. But the topic I wanted to talk today about goes back to this idea of explainability and this intersection between artificial intelligence and decision makers. And for this talk, we'll focus it around the Homeland Security enterprise, given that's who funds this. But we're getting more and more technology that relies on a set of algorithms and techniques to solve problems that humans perform somewhat intuitively or nearly automatically. So when you go to the airport and they look at your ID, now they're using facial recognition and different biometrics sometimes at the airport. And there's a level of trust between the TSO and that artificial intelligence algorithm. The same when your baggage goes through the scanner, and now you're seeing new deployment of CT scanners for your carry-on baggage. You again have an algorithm that's trying to alert the transportation security officer, the TSO, to whether or not there's an illicit good in your bag. And so this human AI teaming becomes really critical at the front lines. We want to think about the AI is very, very good, but we want to ask the human for help sometimes because we want the human to feel involved in the decision-making process. All these things go back to building out trust and reliance. And so we worked with Dr. Mickey Mancinito and Aaron Chu at ASU to design a bunch of experiments for thinking about AI deferral. What this means is if the transportation security officer does the facial recognition, do they trust the AI, or does the AI defer to the TSO to make the decision? And how do we explain how confident the AI is with that decision? And how do we ask them in such a way that we can help build this trust? And so we're trying to make sure to optimize for throughput. We don't always want to be asking the TSO if the AI is very confident, but if we don't show the TSO when the AI is confident and they're only seeing the errors, they lose trust in that. We also want to optimize for things like job satisfaction and perceived accountability for outcomes and the perceived workload from this human AI teaming. And our group's been thinking a lot about how do humans use predictions from these models. There was a really fun, vast contest back in 2013 on predicting how much money a movie would make in the box office. And of course, that's a lot harder now given the pandemic, but let's pretend we're still in 2019 and we can actually relatively predict how much money a movie might make. And we built out this whole system for trying to think about how you could organize different models using support vector machines, deep learning, whatever model you wanted to use for predicting this, showing people the different distributions of data, allowing them to filter based on underlying features, taking into account social media trends, and looking at the algorithms that did sentiment analysis, and how can we combine all of this together. And the model now gives you a predicted value for how much the movie will make. And then does the human trust this? Can the human adjust that output and come up with a better result than the algorithm did by itself? And we wanted to explore this concept of, can a human in the loop help improve predictive accuracy? And so we modified our system from the VAST box office challenge. Our system won the VAST Grand Challenge in 2013. But overall, all of the systems that were sort of submitted to the VAST challenge, you would say, if you looked at them holistically, you would say they all have relatively similar types of features and interactions. So we had 20 participants, 9 movies, and we took 3 different underlying artificial intelligence algorithms models at various levels of accuracy. So our hypothesis here was that if the model can predict with 90+% accuracy, adding a human probably is just going to make it worse. Literature supports that. Maybe at 80% still. Can a human help at 70 or 60%? So we sort of took a 60% accurate model, 75 and 90, and we had people using these models to predict the outcomes of the movies. They had training data where they predicted one movie in practice, and then they had 9 real predictions with 3 models ordered randomly. We also measured their workload and asked them why they made particular decisions. And what we found was that in all of these cases, humans were particularly worse. 40% of our population did wind up having a better prediction than the model, but 60% were worse. And 50% of the participant prediction errors are larger than model predictions. And in fact, participants were statistically significantly worse than just the model by itself. And so here we want to consider a little bit more on the visualization side and the human interaction side about what are the considerations for this human machine intelligence in teaming for some of these predictions. So there's domain knowledge integration, and in visualization, we've argued for a long time that there are domains where human background knowledge is essential and where tacit knowledge can't necessarily be encoded algorithmically. So a human in the loop approach may yield better results. But there is research that has shown that domain expertise diminished people's reliance on algorithmic forecasts and led to worse performance. So is this domain knowledge integration actually giving us what we think? And I think there's a lot of interesting room for research in visualization on this. And then there's been lots of visualization studies for trust. But what I find a little bit vexing right now in VAST is people say, oh, if we let the human adjust the model, they're going to build trust. What's that mean? There's a lot of dimensions for trust, and there are very few user studies from the visual analytics community right now that measure this improved trust. Studies report that forecasters desire to adjust algorithmic outputs. This gives them a sense of ownership. It builds trust. That's a big plus for visualization and interaction. But with all of those things where people are allowed to adjust the model, they're only allowed to adjust within a fixed range where they can't really make it worse. So it's almost like a placebo. And then with visualization and visual analytics, there's this concept of visualization and learning. So the system engages with the user sees the model output, and they say, oh, they misclassified these things. Let me change those classification errors, change the classification boundaries in my model. And this is a really interesting intersection, but how does this impact the longevity of the model? Do we see this leading to overfitting? Do we care about overfitting perhaps? Do we see concept drift occurring with this? What's the implications of having this sort of interaction? I think that's really fun to think about too. And then how can we measure this knowledge integration? And what's the baseline for supporting human machine tasks? What baseline are we comparing against to see if this human machine visual analytics model adjustment is improving the situation? I definitely believe that this is a critical step in building out machine learning algorithms, but it's interesting to think about particular domain users and where these tools should be applied and what part of the machine learning pipeline should they be applied into. And this has led to a lot of work in our lab in thinking about concepts of explainable AI and how can we build explainable models with high level performance? How can we help people understand models, build appropriate trust, and how can they work and manage and team with their AI partners? So asking, why did a model do a particular thing? Why didn't it do something else? How do we know when a model succeeded, when it failed, and how can we allow humans to correct the error? And we've had this sort of idea of training data, machine learning process, learn to function, and the humans do that to build a task. And in XAI, the humans need this explanation. But there's also interesting work coming out of sort of the operations research optimization AI intersection where work from Cynthia Rudin is talking about, should we forego this idea of explainable black box models and only be using interpretable models for high performance decision making, because people need to understand these sorts of trade-offs. And we see this, where if we look, and I'm equally guilty of all these things I complain about, we'll take our machine learning models with multidimensional data and we'll project them into some T-SNEES plot to try to see outliers and things that were mislabeled. Those plots are very, very hard to understand. And is that really an explanation? And we get this on the AI side too, where they'll build some model of explainability where you'll have some sort of measure now and you'll say this model is 0.2 more explainable than the other model. But okay, now how do I explain the explanation becomes quite interesting. And visual analytics, again, I think has a lot of promise here where we can combine this automated analysis with interactive visualizations to enhance understanding, reasoning, and decision-making. And in our lab, we've worked on things like data pre-processing for visual inspection of decision boundaries, interpretable model training by opening the black box of SVMs, We've done a lot of work, obviously, with DHS on the security aspect. We have a grant from NSF on fairness and AI, looking specifically at fairness and security and graph mining algorithms. We were one of the first people looking at visual explanations of adversarial machine learning, and then moved on to now, can we perform like graph auditing, specifically in the context of if you have nation state actors that are trying to manipulate ranking algorithms to prop up misinformation, can we identify some of these sorts of things? And this moved on to the idea of fairness in rankings now as well in our recent work at Viz 2021. And so this hopefully gives you an idea of some of the things that we've been doing in the Vader Lab. This work is supported by the US Department of Homeland Security and the National Science Foundation. And what I'm really excited about is sort of this intersection between space, time, and explainability. We have all of these geographic models now. We have people that are trying to reason about what's the causal effects within these spatial temporal processes and bringing in this external information to explain these, tying this together with interesting concepts from SciViz of applying well-known topological aspects, but seeing how this sort of breaks apart the data, to more traditional VASTI stuff for machine learning model exploration on the other side. I'd be happy to take any questions or discuss any of this. And thank you again very much for inviting me. Hopefully this was coherent.
Great, thank you, Russ. That was really interesting and just so many different important and interesting topics. There are a few questions in the chat. Or Chuck and Jeff, do you want to just ask your questions or?
So yeah, you know, my question was when the first slides came out, you're mapping this urban environment. It's not all urban environments are like Phoenix, where there's not many trees. And if you're trying to look at the amount of sky that you see, it's really dependent upon the foliage that's above you. And have you tried that in other cities where you may not have the same view that you would in Phoenix?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, let's see if I go back to that slide real quick. The paper that I referenced in that slide actually will provide you with, I think we did 5 cities around the globe with completely different, what you might call, let's say, urban footprints, and showing the different sky view factors for these different cities and showing sort of what that looks like. And you're right, depending on the time of year, we may get problems with the data using Google Street View. So here's some of the sky view factors for different cities. So you can see the different foliage on trees. So palm trees versus your deciduous versus your conifers. The main problem with this approach in urban informatics right now is this data is collected sporadically. Urban form changes very, very quickly. But the problem is this is sort of the best we have at that very granular level. So this was a good step forward, and this has really taken off in popularity. This is now some of my most cited work after just a couple years of this. So I was really surprised in how much the urban community has wanted to do this and how many different things we can expand this to. But there definitely is a severe limitation on what time of year was the picture taken, and do those trees exist anymore? Does that building exist anymore?
Jeff, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. So this was a question about the crime monitoring when you're talking about Purdue, and so you may know that there have been these concerns about predictive policing that they have led to these feedback cycles where because more police have been in an area, then they report more crime, and then they deploy more police and they observe more crime, and this has actually led to some people have argued this has led to discrimination against certain groups. And so you kind of got into these issues a little bit later with the explainable AI sort of stuff. But when you were looking at this crime data, did you kind of consider how this correlate with the police deployment? You know, as long as you're talking about this, I just had to ask.
No, that's a great question. And this intersection of ethics and fairness in AI is really critical, and that's been a big criticism of predictive policing. And you're right, you know, where police go, that's where you'll get more arrests that take place. And what's interesting with a lot of these data sets is actually, if you want to guess what the location that has the most crime in a city is, you probably can go ahead and guess the police department, because the default address for many of the police blotter reports is the precinct. So those are really critical sorts of things. And what we had worked with the other DHS center called CREATE in early 2008 was trying to take into account game theoretic applications of models for better predictive policing to allow for randomization in the patrol routes while still hitting major areas that are known to need to be looked at, to allow for capturing a better distribution of this. And this randomization, so this wasn't our work, but CREATE had a great claim to fame. This is actually Lynn Tombay's work, who's now at Harvard, did this with what they called, now I'm blanking on the name of the tool. This is deployed at LAX, and I'll give me 5 minutes and the name will come back to me. And they randomized the patrol route of all the transportation security officers at LAX, and this wound up having something like a $6 million increase in contraband detection. And so taking that sort of game theoretic approach and applying that with the operations research and predictive policing, so saying, okay, these hotspots we know are important, but we can't focus all of our resources here. How do we use time of day components and interesting things to say, hey, you know, patrol these at these spots of day and then randomly patrol other spots, and how do we create that? Police routing can help with that. But there's definitely still issues of fairness in AI. And this becomes really weird in geography too, because you may say, okay, I'm gonna not train my algorithm on ethnicity. But since I trained it on location, and location is directly correlated to ethnicity, you break that thing altogether. So I think that's a really fun intersection to think about that I don't have all the answers for, but that's sort of how we're trying to approach it to get around some of those well-known problems.
Yeah, great. So thanks, and you should keep the police officers in the shade on those routes. So,
Very good. I had a question about, I guess, understanding more about the uncertainty and reproducibility in the AI systems. And for most of the machine learning systems out there, they're black boxes that give you back an answer, and they don't come with error bounds or confidence intervals. And it sounds like you've done some work in actually associating, I guess you called it risk, in terms of the viability of the algorithm. And is that this, I guess, the same or similar of like putting confidence intervals on the AI results?
I would say yes, that is similar. And we have a really exciting paper, I think, under review at TVCG on this concept of showing levels of uncertainty with the model prediction as it correlates to, let's call it model reliance. So how much uncertainty are people willing to accept in terms of then making a decision on whether or not to rely on the model, and how much does the visualization and the type of visualization used to illustrate that uncertainty correlate to their reliance. So what we found is that in cases where there is high uncertainty, there is less reliance, but depends on which visualization type is used to communicate that level of uncertainty. And then the fancier the visualization looks, if you go from, let's say, a bar chart to a violin plot, people rely more on that because they feel that they have been given more information and understand those better, but they actually wind up relying on things when they shouldn't. And some of the simpler visualizations where you just sort of say, okay, here's like a frequency to represent, 4 question marks is high uncertainty, then people calibrate their reliance level appropriately, where they don't rely on the model when it's highly uncertain, and they rely on it better when it's less uncertain. I don't know that I got to answer your question necessarily, Chris, but I think I think this intersection of uncertainty, model reliance, trust is just ripe for a ton of work and visualization. And I get really tired of us saying, oh, visualization builds trust. But does it always? And I'd like to see, like, what are the bounds? Like, what's the design space for, like, should we be worried if we made a visualization this way? Does it actually lead to distrust?
Yeah, that I agree. And I would really appreciate if you would send me a preprint of that article. I'm very interested in this.
Sure.
This topic. And I remember a really great talk that McCachran gave at a recent Viz conference pre-pandemic, where he was talking about people's ability to make decisions under uncertainty, and that he was just stressing how bad we are at it, and that you can't give them very much information about the uncertainty because it just confuses them. And his view was like, you just give them, it's either it's really uncertain or it's certain. And maybe if they're sophisticated, you can have a third middle uncertainty. But it was like, the more you told them about the uncertainty, the worse they're going to do, because we're just so bad at probability and reasoning under uncertainty. Yes, Jeff.
So yeah, so I had another question. So sort of following up on so the stuff Chris was asking, and so I thought this study was really interesting. You did where you had where you tried to put the human in the loop, and you found that humans so didn't actually help that much. So my understanding, kind of from seeing similar approaches, has been that there are kind of two cases where humans will change from what the machine learning is doing. The machine learning is optimized to do extremely well in prediction, but the issue is the prediction is not always the right task, right? There's this study of like these, like CT scans or something where the computer picked up on that they were taken at two different hospitals, and those hospitals had different rates of something, and so it could pick up on that, which was independent of the actual kind of information it was supposed to be capturing, right? And so a human can potentially pick up on these sort of differences and help kind of factor this out. And this is something which is probably going to make the accuracy worse, but is helpful in giving an explanation, which is so better. And so this is a place where a human is great, but the other side is that humans have like implicit or so not implicit biases, which they put into the decision making. And it's possible, not all machine learning algorithms do this, but you could have a machine learning algorithm try to enforce a degree of fairness in the result, which a human might undo. And this might improve the prediction, might not improve the prediction. But this is something you probably don't want a human to do, unless this is a certain type of bias that is actually helpful, in the prediction. So can you comment on how your study interplays with these factors, or if there's some other part of this you think a big piece I'm missing?
Sure. So let's see how to unpack that. So with this particular study, I would say this probably is closer akin to a specific decision-making work. Primarily, we were building off of, let me find the right picture here. Primarily, I've been reading this work from Dietvorst, and this is the algorithmic aversion work, where he would build a model and ask people to predict. And we thought, okay, well, let's do that same sort of task, but we add a visualization system where people can explore the model and adjust things and then make a prediction and see if that helps. And all of his work found that humans made it worse. Now, I think there are other studies that can be done, such as we can have interactive machine learning where people are doing visual relabeling and things, where that gets to your point of humans are good at identifying perhaps these mismatches in that these images were taken at different hospitals. The other classic example of this was in the 70s when they were trying to train machine learning to identify Russian tanks, and they had a whole bunch of images of Russian tanks in the jungle. and all the pictures of the tanks were taken during the day, and the other pictures were taken when it was cloudy. And so it trained on tanks were there if there was sunlight versus not sunlight, basically. So I think there's other studies that need to be done, maybe not necessarily on sort of the final visualization leading up to the final decision, which is sort of what I did, but visualization and changing these labels, building out the model, and then maybe looking at some sort of concept drift over time. Did the human wind up overfitting or issues there? I think your notion of enforcing constraints of fairness could be really good. What I'd worry about with humans adjusting the model weights and things is, do they just adjust to their biases? And I do wonder if visualization just makes that easier to adjust to our sorts of biases. But even in the fairness optimization things in our recent VAST, not VAST, we don't have VAST anymore. In our recent Viz paper in 2021, we built out Fair Rank Viz with Hong Hong Tong's group at UIUC that's looking at fairness and ranking and machine learning. And basically, you might optimize for a particular fair constraint with algorithm A, and this leads to bad outcomes for either certain individuals or certain groups or other sorts of ranking issues. And then how do you compare these different favors of fairness between algorithms where, yes, it's fair in this dimension, but not in this. And so I don't have good answers for all of that, but I think there's interesting research at the sort of intersection of visualization and decision making and visualization and model building. And I don't know yet where the bridge is between those, but I'm sure there is one.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ross. We're past the hour, and I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially you, Ross. It was a really fantastic talk, and I'm sure that multiple people will follow up and read the papers, and I will certainly want to follow up and talk with you further. So thank you very much.
And thanks again for
Ross.
inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. All right. We'll see you guys later, and thanks for another great visualization seminar.